Lang nerds, welcome to Elang Explained. This video is part of our Writing Prep and Strategy series, where we break down the different sections of the English language exam to give you some tips and strategies on how best to approach the short answer, AC, and essay. Get excited because today we're going to be talking about spoken discourse features. So, what are spoken discourse features? Well, these are elements of language that are commonly used in text with a spoken mode, but can be mimicked by written discourse features in some texts. So when we're analysing spoken discourse features, we are absolutely expecting that this text has a spoken mode, but we're also recognising that spoken discourse features can be used across all registers. We can see spoken discourse features in a formal text or an informal text. And while these same set of features can appear in text with both a formal and informal register, how they appear will look a little bit different. So, spoken discourse features can be remembered using the mnemonic device COUDAM. And when we break that up, we've got COU, our closings, openings, and overlapping speech. And then the DAM is our discourse markers or particles, adjacency pairs, minimal responses or back channels, and non-fluency features. Now, you've probably already noticed on this list those two slashes. So we can call discourse markers, or we can label them as discourse particles. We can talk about minimal responses, or we can talk about back channels. Now, both of these terms are the correct labels for the same feature. So it's really important that you, as a keen green bean Elang student, learns both labels, because you absolutely might get a short answer question that asks you to discuss minimal responses, or a short answer question that asks you to discuss back channeling. Now, as an informed Elang student, you are going to be able to recognize that both of these terms are actually talking about the same language feature. And if you do ever get a short answer question that asks you about discourse markers, it's a really good strategic choice to, in your response, use that meta language that is provided in the question. Even though calling this language feature a discourse particle would be correct, if the question asks you to talk about discourse markers, make sure you talk about discourse markers. Let's go a little bit more in depth now though, and explain what each of these spoken discourse features includes. So, we're going to work our way through COUDAM, and that means we are starting with closings. Now, closings signal the end of a discourse, and many texts will use a closing that is conventional for that situational context. Now, what is a convention for a particular text type is very dependent, we know, on things like the field, the register, the purpose, and intent. So when we're looking for those closings, it's really important to be very aware of that situational context, register, and the purpose and intent of the text. Because in a more informal text, we might see a closing like bye, where we might see a closing like bye, where we've got elongation of that E sound, to really emphasize and put a little bit of stress on this conventional closing to signal that end of the discourse. However, for a more formal text like an address to Parliament, we might see a much more formal closing that is more formulaic, something like, "Thank you all for listening today, and I'm now going to yield the floor to the speaker." So, the language that is used as a closing will very much depend on the situational context. It's also important to remember that not every text will have a closing, because we in English language will often only analyse part of a text. And so we might see a text that, if it starts at the beginning, has an opening but doesn't have a closing. And if it's a text that is just the middle, we might not see an opening or closing. If it's a text that's just the end though, that's where we'll probably see the closing of that text. Next up, we have openings. And just like closings signal the end of a discourse, the opening signals the beginning of a discourse. And many texts will use openings that are conventional within the situational context. So we have openings that are much more informal, like hey, hi, sup. We have openings that are much more formal, like good morning, members of Parliament. And of course, we have an opening that you are already, I'm sure, very familiar with on this channel with Hey Lang Nerds. Now, these openings will often be something that can be useful for us to look at when we're figuring out the tenor of a text. Because often an opening, when we are addressing the audience or addressing the other participants in a discourse for the first time, we're deliberately using language to try and reflect the relationship that we do have with the other participants or with the audience. Now, like I said for closings, it's really important to remember that not every text will have an opening. And so it's really important when we're analysing spoken discourse features that we are paying really close attention to the text that we are given. And even though we are looking for all of the elements in COUDAM, we're also very critical readers of this text that we are analysing and making sure that we're focusing on what is in the text and which spoken discourse features we can see really clearly in the text, instead of trying to identify every feature and maybe missing some of the key parts of the text or incorrectly applying a label of an opening or a closing to part of a text that actually is just signaling a change in topic. Next up, the last element of the coup in COUDAM is overlapping speech. Now, this happens when two speakers are trying to hold the floor at the same time and they end up speaking over each other. Now, overlaps happen for lots of reasons. So we can talk about overlapping speech as being cooperative, and cooperative overlaps happen when one speaker is holding the floor and the other speaker uses minimal responses or back channeling, a language feature we're going to talk about in a moment, to signal their engagement. Now, cooperative overlapping like this might happen if someone is talking and you want to signal your agreement and you say something like, yes, definitely. It could happen when you want to signal your disagreement. You say, oh no. Now, with that minimal response, you're not trying to take the floor there. You're just signaling your engagement and your agreement or your disagreement. But you're signaling to the other speaker that you want them to continue holding the floor. On the flip side, we also have uncooperative overlapping. And this occurs when one speaker is holding the floor, and instead of passing the floor to another speaker, that other speaker who is looking to take the floor has to start speaking over the top of our first speaker. So I've got an example of an overlap here where E says, that new series is, and then at the same time, E and L say, so good, which series? And so my question for you all is this a cooperative or an uncooperative overlap? And if you think you know the answer, add it to the comments below. Next up, we have discourse markers and discourse particles. Now, it's really important to remember that you can use either of these terms when you are analysing this spoken discourse feature. But like I said earlier in this video, if you're asked a short answer question about discourse particles, make sure that your answer uses the meta language of the question and talks about the role of discourse particles in the text. Discourse markers and particles, though, refer to those elements of the text that are used to help manage the flow, structure, and communication of information. This is an umbrella term. So discourse markers and discourse particles are umbrella terms for a range of language features that do this. And some of the really common things are hedges, pause fillers, interrogative tags, and conjunctions. So we've got an example sentence here. So, it's a great show, right? Now, if we were going to analyse this sentence, looking at our discourse markers, we might look at the subordinating conjunction so here, that signals a change in the topic or that signals this speaker taking the floor so that they're able to share their opinion. We could look at here as a hedge or a pause filler because hedges, of course, take our declaratives and they clarify them a little bit. They refer to them as an opinion. They weaken that very strong statement. But it's also a pause filler here. We could replace with and we can infer here that this is allowing our speaker to build some time for them to figure out what they're going to say next. We've also got the interrogative tag right at the end. So we've got it's a great show, which is a declarative, but we add the interrogative tag right, and it turns our declarative sentence into an interrogative. So if you were going to analyse this one utterance, you've actually got quite a few options to talk about for discourse markers and particles. But as always, Lang Nerds, it's really important that you make the most strategic choice when you're analysing discourse markers and particles, but also when you're looking at spoken discourse features in a text. And so in this example, you will hopefully already be starting to think, oh, if I was going to analyze this, the discourse marker that I would choose to focus on is this part of the sentence because it's most strategic for me. And that is the beauty of a strategic choice. We all have different brains. We've all got different favorite pieces of metalanguage. And so when we're doing any analysis, we should always be listening to those parts of our brain that will help us make the most strategic choice and choose the language features that are going to be easiest for us to most effectively analyze. Up next, we have adjacency pairs. Now, I'm going to say that again. Adjacency pairs. When we're analysing this language feature, we're talking about a group of two very closely related utterances. Now, it's really important to remember that this is not adjacency single sentence. This is adjacency pairs. And so when we're thinking about this spoken discourse feature, we are always looking at the language used by the first speaker and the prompted reply from the second speaker. So adjacency pairs can take lots of different forms, but they'll often include things like question and answer pairs, greeting pairs, or complements and a response. So here we have an example of an adjacency pair that is a question and answer, but it's also a greeting pair. So here we've got the interrogative, how are you today? And then that second part of the adjacency pair, the prompted response, good thanks. We could have also had an adjacency pair of something like, I love that dress. And then L would respond with something like, thanks. Or, I really like your shoes. And so here, when we're looking at adjacency pairs, we're specifically focusing on those closely related utterances. So if you're looking at a text and you see, for example, a question, a greeting, or a compliment, and you kind of already know, you can predict, you can infer what the second response is going to be, then it's an adjacency pair because that would represent a close relationship between the initial language used and that prompted reply. Next up, we have minimal responses and back channels. Now, minimal responses and back channels, just like discourse markers and particles, are two terms for the same language feature. And this refers to a shortened response which allows one speaker to signal that they are either paying close attention and that they're engaged in what the other speaker is saying, or to signal their agreement or disagreement with what the other speaker is saying. So in this example between E and L, we've got E using the declarative, that new series is so good, and then L using the minimal response, with a little bit of elongation on that M, to signal that they are engaged, they're listening, but also that they are agreeing with M here. Now, our last spoken discourse feature is that umbrella term of non-fluency features. Now, non-fluency features includes pauses, so those moments in a discourse where we see one speaker take a short pause, a long pause, a medium pause, but they stop speaking for a moment. Or they use a filled pause or a voiced hesitation. Now, this is another pair of terms that refer to exactly the same language feature. So you can use either term in your analysis. But a filled pause or a voiced hesitation occurs when we use a pause filler to fill a pause. So it's a pause when someone stops speaking. But it's a filled pause or a voiced hesitation when someone is speaking and they, instead of pausing, use maybe a non-lexical utterance, or they might use a hedge. I think what I'm trying to say is that these filled pauses and voiced hesitations take the place of a pause. And very often they're doing the same thing as a pause. They're allowing our speaker to buy some time for them to figure out what they are trying to say. They also might reflect the level of planning that a speaker has undergone, how confident they're feeling with the topic, with the content, with the things that they're talking about, or in the setting that they are speaking in. Next up, as a non-fluency feature, we have repetition. Now, repetition is also an element of cohesion, so it's important to have a look at the repetition that's being used. Because if it's a non-fluency feature, it's repetition that's being used to perhaps signal that this person speaking isn't as confident with what they're saying, they haven't done as much planning. Whereas if we're thinking about repetition from a cohesion standpoint, that's repetition that's being used very deliberately to link two parts of the text and show connection between the ideas that are being discussed. Then we have repairs. Now, We as humans use repairs all the time when we are speaking. And this happens when we start saying something and we're in the middle of a sentence and we're going to say something, we're going to use language to communicate, but we need to make a little change. We need to alter what we've said in some way. Now, repairs are different to false starts, which is our last non-fluency feature, because repairs happen in the middle of a sentence, but false starts happen at the beginning. So if I'm about to begin a sentence and I need to go back to the beginning because I realize I've said something that I would like to edit, that I'd like to change, that maybe isn't as accurate, doesn't flow as well, then it's a false start. But if I'm in the middle of my sentence and I've realized that I've said the wrong word or I need to go back and update what I've said, then it's a repair. Now, non-fluency features can be used for lots of different reasons in spoken discourse. They can be used to reflect the level of planning, spontaneity, and rehearsal of a discourse. So how familiar a speaker is with what they're saying, how much planning they've done of their speech, and how much rehearsing and practice they've done of what they're going to say. But non-fluency features can also reflect the comfort of a speaker with the situational context of the text. So it might show that perhaps they are less comfortable with the field that they're talking about, if there are lots of pauses or voiced hesitations. It might show that in the setting they are a little bit nervous. But the other thing to remember is that non-fluency features happen in spoken discourse for lots of different reasons. And so they might actually just be being used because as humans, when we're speaking, very often we want to update the things that we are saying. And so when we're analysing non-fluency features, it's really important to be careful and it's really important to be critical readers and to make sure that we are looking very closely at the text we've been given to see if we can identify what the non-fluency features are actually doing in the text that we are analysing. So I'm going to give you a moment now to have a look at a text that you probably haven't seen before. This text is an interview from the Australian news program The Project. And in this interview, the hosts of the project, Waleed Ali and Steve Price, are interviewing Australian comedian Sammy J about his strategies for faking knowledge of sports during radio interviews. So take a moment here and see if you can identify the spoken discourse features in this text. And I'm going to be honest and say I've been a little bit sneaky here because there is one spoken discourse feature that doesn't appear in this text. How'd you go? Now you can see I have color-coded all of the spoken discourse features that appear in this text. But were you able to spot that this text doesn't have a closing? Now, we've got our opening in green, so we can see Waleed Ali welcomes Sammy J to this interview, this segment on the project with, "Would you please welcome the very unsporty Sammy J." We've got two examples of overlapping speech in the red, where Waleed Ali and Sammy J are talking over each other. Our discourse markers and particles in this text are in grey, and there are lots of discourse markers here, but I've highlighted a couple of them. And you've probably already noticed that most of the discourse markers I've highlighted in this text are conjunctions that are used to begin sentences. And so they're allowing WA and SJ to steer this conversation. They're helping them manage the topic of what they're saying. In blue, we've got our adjacency pairs. Now, when we're thinking about adjacency pairs, it's important to remember that an adjacency pair is a question that prompts a response. So here on line 16, where Waleed Ali says, "But what if it's different?" And then Sammy J says, "Then you say like, gee, you must have felt the pressure," we can see here that this question is deliberately prompting this response from Sammy J. And he's able to expand on it in his following sentence, "Like, imagine you're a footballer." Now, we've got a couple of minimal responses in this text in the yellow, but the one I want us to take a moment and have a look at now together is on line 15, because line 15 is both overlapping and a minimal response in the well, yeah. Now here, we could talk about this as a cooperative overlap, because Sammy J is using a minimal response with that phrase, well, yeah, to signal that he is actively listening, he's agreeing with Waleed Ali, but he's not trying to take the floor here. He's just signaling that agreement and engagement. And if you're a king green bean when you're doing your analysis, this would be one of those places to double your meta language. And instead of labeling line 15 as just overlapping speech, you might label it as overlapping that includes a minimal response, to allow SJ to signal his agreement with Waleed Ali. And lastly, we have non-fluency features. Now, I have not highlighted every non-fluency feature in this text in purple. There's a lot of pausing in this text. So you'll see that there's a lot of pausing in this text, and you probably have highlighted more examples than I have. My challenge for you, though, is with the purple bubbles I've highlighted, can you identify whether they are repairs or false starts? So if we have a look on line 3, we've got hey, pause, hi project. Now, we could absolutely talk about the pause as a non-fluency feature. But is this a repair or a false start? Because Sammy J has started with hey and then rephrased and expanded hi project, this one's a false start. But if we jump down to line 13, we've got, like you just say, pause, non-fluency feature, which we could absolutely discuss. For example, longer pause, big game out there. We could talk about the for example here as a hedge. We could talk about it as a voiced hesitation. We could also talk about this as a pause filler, because it's allowing Sammy J to here figure out what he is going to say next. It's buying that thinking time for him. So we've got that non-fluency feature there, okay? So when we're analysing spoken discourse features, these are our top 3 Elang Explained tips. Number 1, remember to be specific when you are quoting your examples. When you're quoting adjacency pairs, make sure to quote both parts of the adjacency pair. If you're talking about the non-fluency feature of pausing, it can feel a little bit clunky to quote a pause, but make sure you do. It's a really strategic choice to quote an example of every language feature that you are analysing within a text. Tip number 2, while you can use the label minimal response or back channels or discourse markers or particles, it's really important to learn both terms and make sure that you use a consistent term in your analysis. So if you had a short answer question that asked you to analyse minimal responses, make sure your answer focuses on minimal responses. But if you're writing your AC or essay, or you get a short answer question that asks you about spoken discourse features, it's your choice whether you are going to be a lang nerd who calls this feature minimal responses or back channels, as long as you're consistent throughout your response. And tip number 3 is that while spoken discourse features are most commonly found in texts that use a spoken mode, some written language features can mimic spoken discourse features. So we've got the opening, hey, written down here, but it's still an opening. Dear English language students is still an opening even though it's written. And if we look at something like the complex sentence, so then I thought to myself, today is Monday, right? This sentence is written, but we've got lots of non-fluency features here that we could talk about. And these features are still non-fluency features. They're mimicking a spoken discourse feature, even though this is from the written mode. Okay, and lucky last, tip number 4 is that prosodic features are not spoken discourse features. So prosodic features, pitch, tempo, volume, intonation, stress, are absolutely language features that we see all the time when we are looking at a spoken text. But they are prosodic features. They're not spoken discourse features. So if you were to get a short answer question that asks you about spoken discourse features, make sure you remember COUDAM. But that's all we have time for today.
Remember to be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time for more Elang Explained.